Karen ripped open the HOA notice, her blood pressure spiking with each word she read. $5,000 fine. Excessive vehicle presence. Effective immediately. She reread the notice, her hand trembling. It was preposterous, outrageous. They were talking about her cars, parked neatly around her guest house. This was harassment, plain and simple, and she wouldn't stand for it. She marched out, the flimsy paper clutched in her hand, a storm brewing in her chest. Her perfectly manicured lawn shimmered under the midday sun, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her. She spotted Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, fussing over his prized roses a few houses down. Harold. She called out, her voice tight with controlled fury. Mr. Henderson looked up, startled, his shears snipping awkwardly at a rosebud. Karen, he began, a nervous smile twitching at his lips. He clearly knew what was coming. This, she spat, thrusting the notice in his face, is absurd. Since when is parking on my property a finable offense? Mr. Henderson stammered, pushing his glasses up his nose. Now, Karen, the board received several complaints. Multiple vehicles. Obstructing what? Karen interrupted, her voice laced with icy calm. My driveway is on my property. My cars are legally registered. And last I checked, this wasn't a communist country where the HOA dictates how many vehicles I can own. Harold's face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Karen cut him off again. Call a board meeting, Harold. I expect a full explanation and a retraction of this ludicrous fine. Today. With that, she turned on her heel and strode back towards her house, leaving a stunned Mr. Henderson speechless amongst his roses. She had a plan. She would fight this, tooth and nail. After all, they'd picked a fight with the wrong resident. What they didn't know, however, was that this wasn't just her house. This was her neighborhood. The slam of Karen's front door echoed through the opulent foyer of her sprawling home. Fury simmered beneath her skin, a potent cocktail mixed with a chilling sense of amusement. They thought she was being unreasonable. Oh, she would give them unreasonable. She marched towards her home office, a smirk playing on her lips. The walls were lined with framed blueprints and development plans, testaments to her successful career as a real estate developer. She stopped at a large mahogany cabinet, pulling open a drawer filled with meticulously organized files. Oakhaven Estates, read the label on the topmost folder. She pulled it open, retrieving a thick stack of documents, the original development contract for the entire neighborhood. Her father, a shrewd businessman, had entrusted it to her years ago, along with a piece of advice she never forgot. Ownership is leverage, Karen. Never forget that. Armed with the contract and a pot of freshly brewed coffee, Karen settled at her desk. She dialed a number she knew by heart. Her lawyer, Daniel, always picked up on the second ring. Daniel, darling, she said, her voice smooth as silk. It seems our dear HOA is flexing its non-existent muscles again. Something about excessive vehicle presence. Absurd, isn't it? Especially considering they seem to have forgotten who actually owns this little slice of suburbia. Daniel chuckled, a deep, reassuring sound. Let me guess, Harold Henderson paid you a visit. The man wouldn't know a legally binding contract if it bid him on his prize-winning roses, Karen scoffed. I need you to draft a little reminder for our HOA board. Something that clearly outlines the original development agreement, specifically the clause regarding resident parking regulations, or lack thereof. She paused, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Oh, and Daniel? Make sure to highlight the part where the HOA president signs off on any and all resident disputes regarding property usage. It's going to be a fascinating board meeting, don't you think? The air crackled with anticipation as Karen entered the community clubhouse, a smug smile playing on her lips. Residents, their faces a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, whispered amongst themselves. Harold Henderson, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his ill-fitting suit, fidgeted with his gavel. The board members, usually a picture of bored disinterest, shifted uneasily in their seats. Karen, however, exuded an aura of serene confidence as she took a seat in the front row, placing a thick document on the table before her. Beside it sat her constant companion, a sleek, silver laptop, its screen glowing ominously. Harold, attempting to regain control of the room, rapped his gavel. Order. This emergency meeting has been called to address certain concerns regarding Mrs. Thompson's automotive situation. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Karen raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. Automotive situation. She stifled a laugh. Harold was even more inept than she remembered. Daniel, his presence commanding attention, rose from his seat beside Karen. Actually, Harold, he began, his voice smooth but firm. I believe this meeting concerns a slight oversight on the HOA's part regarding the original development contract for Oak Haven Estates. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Harold sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. Oversight, he stammered. I'm not sure I understand. Daniel smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. Well, Harold, he drawled, picking up the hefty document beside Karen. It seems you've forgotten a key clause in this legally binding agreement. One that explicitly grants Mrs. Thompson certain privileges. He paused again, savoring the stunned silence that had descended upon the room. Leaning forward, he dropped the bombshell. Privileges, I might add, that includes sole discretion over resident parking regulations within Oak Haven Estates. A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the room, quickly escalating into a cacophony of disbelief. Harold Henderson's jaw gaped, his complexion now a sickly shade of gray. The other board members exchanged panicked glances, their carefully cultivated air of authority crumbling before their eyes. Do you what? Harold stammered, his voice barely a whisper. That's impossible. Daniel, enjoying the stunned silence, leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Impossible. He echoed, his voice dripping with amusement. I assure you, Harold, everything stated here is perfectly legal and binding. Perhaps you'd care to refresh your memory? He opened the document, deliberately turning the pages to land on a section highlighted with bright yellow marker. With a flourish, he presented the highlighted section to the room. This, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel announced, his voice resonating with authority, is the signature of one Mr. Harold Henderson, agreeing to the terms and conditions outlined in the Oak Haven Estates development contract. A contract, I might remind you, that grants Mrs. Thompson full autonomy over matters pertaining to resident parking. Karen, throughout this entire spectacle, maintained an air of cool indifference, occasionally sipping her coffee as if this were just another mundane meeting. She allowed Daniel to orchestrate the drama, knowing his theatrical flair would maximize the impact. As Harold sputtered, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, a voice rang out from the back of the room. So, what does this mean? Does she own the whole neighborhood? The question, simple yet loaded, hung in the air, instantly shifting the atmosphere from stunned disbelief to one of simmering unease. All eyes turned to Karen, their expressions a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grudging flicker of respect. Karen, finally deciding to grace the room with her attention, placed her coffee mug on the table with a delicate clink. All eyes swiveled to her, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and morbid fascination. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her lips. That's a very astute question, Mrs. She began, letting the inquiry hang in the air. Fitzgerald, the woman offered hesitantly. Margaret Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Karen repeated, her voice smooth as velvet. To answer your question, owning might not be the correct term. Let's just say, she paused, savoring the palpable tension in the room, I have a vested interest in ensuring Oakhaven Estates remains, well, exactly how my father envisioned it when he built this community. Harold, his face now a mottled shade of purple, attempted to interject. Now hold on just a minute. Karen silenced him with a raised hand, her smile never faltering. You'll have your turn, Harold. But first, let's clarify something. This, she gestured around the room, her gaze sweeping over the anxious faces before her, isn't about parking spaces. This is about respect. Respect for the covenants we all agreed to when we chose to live in Oakhaven Estates. And more importantly, her voice hardened, respect for the legacy my father worked tirelessly to establish. She stood, her gaze settling on Harold. You chose to target me, Harold. You chose to twist the rules, to bully and intimidate. You assumed I wouldn't fight back. You assumed wrong. Karen retrieved the HOA violation notice from the table, her fingers closing around it with controlled anger. With a swift motion, she ripped the paper in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. Consider this my official response to your baseless accusations. Her voice, though quiet, commanded the room. And for those of you who might be wondering, she added, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the residents, rest assured, my vision for Oakhaven Estates aligns perfectly with my father's original intent. A community of peace, prosperity, and ample parking. A stunned silence followed Karen's pronouncements, broken only by the sharp intake of breath as Margaret Fitzgerald, emboldened by Karen's display, dared to speak. So, what happens now? Karen allowed a small, knowing smile to grace her lips. Now, she began, her voice regaining its usual pleasant tone, we move forward. The HOA will, of course, function as intended, but with a renewed understanding of its purpose, to serve the residents, not dictate to them. Harold, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage, finally found his voice. This is preposterous. You can't just... He spluttered, his words failing him as Karen fixed him with a chillingly calm stare. Oh, but I can, Harold, Karen interjected, her voice laced with steel. And I will. You see, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, now holding the attention of every single person present, Oakhaven Estates isn't just a neighborhood to me. It's a legacy. And I intend to honor that legacy by ensuring that it remains a place where people feel welcome, safe, and yes, even free to park their cars without fear of absurd fines. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, catching even Karen off guard. Perhaps she had underestimated the level of simmering resentment towards the overzealous HOA. Now, she continued, reclaiming the room's attention, I believe this meeting has served its purpose. Daniel will be drafting a revised set of HOA guidelines, incorporating the original terms outlined in the development contract. You will all, of course, receive a copy for your review. She paused, allowing a beat of silence to emphasize her next words. And Harold, she said, her voice deceptively sweet, I suggest you find a new hobby, perhaps something less thorny. With a final, triumphant nod, Karen turned towards the exit, leaving behind a room buzzing with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a newfound sense of hope. But as she walked away, a new thought crossed her mind, bringing a mischievous glint to her eye. She wasn't done yet. Not even close. The satisfying click-clack of Karen's heels echoed through the hushed hallway as she exited the clubhouse, a wave of murmured conversations erupting behind her. She could practically taste the fear mixed with begrudging respect that now clung to her like an expensive perfume. It was intoxicating. But Karen wasn't one to rest on her laurels. She had a neighborhood to reshape. As she approached her car, a sleek silver Mercedes that practically screams success, a new, bolder idea began to take root in her mind. Instead of simply reverting back to her father's original vision, why not improve upon it? Oakhaven Estates had the potential to be so much more than a collection of cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns. It could be a vibrant, thriving community, a shining example of her family's legacy. Her phone buzzed in her purse. It was Daniel, no doubt calling to congratulate her on her masterful handling of the HOA board. She silenced the call, a new sense of purpose filling her. She'd call him back later. Right now, she had work to do. Reaching her car, she didn't climb in. Instead, she turned, her gaze sweeping across the meticulously maintained but ultimately sterile landscape of Oakhaven Estates. She envisioned community gardens bursting with color, a charming gazebo nestled amongst the trees for neighborhood gatherings, a state-of-the-art playground for the children who, as of yet, were strangely absent from this supposedly family-friendly environment. Yes, Oakhaven Estates was due for a makeover. And Karen, armed with the power vested in her by a forgotten contract and fueled by a desire to honor her father's memory in a way no one could have anticipated, was just the woman to make it happen. She would show them all what a real community looked like. News traveled fast in Oakhaven Estates. Within days, Karen's legendary takedown of the HOA became the talk of the neighborhood. Gone were the wary glances and hushed whispers. In their place bloomed a cautious curiosity, a sense of anticipation for what this unexpected power shift might bring. Karen, a woman of action, didn't disappoint. She started small, strategically placing flyers on doorsteps, announcing a community vision meeting to be held at her estate, the largest, most opulent symbol of power in Oakhaven. The turnout was unexpected. Families, drawn out by the promise of change and the allure of sneaking a peek inside the elusive Mrs. Thompson's mansion, filled Karen's grand foyer. Harold Henderson, looking defeated and smaller than ever, sat alone in a corner, nervously sipping a drink offered by one of Karen's impeccably dressed staff. Karen, radiating an air of quiet confidence, addressed the crowd. Oakhaven Estates, she began, her voice resonating with a newfound warmth, deserves to be more than just a neighborhood. It deserves to be a community. She outlined her vision: community gardens, a vibrant park, family-friendly events. She spoke of shared responsibility, of fostering a sense of belonging. And as she spoke, something remarkable happened. The skepticism that had initially laced the air evaporated, replaced by a tentative hope, a spark of excitement for a future they hadn't dared to imagine. The meeting stretched on, fueled by a newfound sense of community spirit and an endless supply of refreshments provided by Karen's seemingly bottomless pockets. By the end, committees had been formed, plans were drawn, and a sense of optimism, absent for far too long, filled the room. Karen, watching the community come alive before her eyes, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had neutralized the threat, honored her father's legacy, and maybe, just maybe, created something even better than she had ever imagined. But as she surveyed the room, her gaze fell on a lone figure, lingering by the refreshments table. A young boy, no older than 10, looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching a cookie. "It's going to be amazing." And in that moment, Karen knew she wasn't finished. This was just the beginning.